What up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another video. Today is going to be all about tapering, specifically for Special Forces Assessment and Selection, aka SFAS, but it's going to apply to other tapers. Just a general overview of what it looks like to taper. Tapering for selection is a little bit different than tapering for like a one-day event, but honestly, the overall concepts apply to whatever you're tapering for. And tapering usually is more known as being an endurance sport thing, but it also applies to strength sports. It also applies really to any sports. So this is definitely an important thing. And it's something that there's a lot of different ways to mess up, which I'll get into a little bit later. And there's really only a few different ways to do it right, but it is super simple if you are able to handle it mentally. And that's usually what gets guys in trouble, is they start having all this extra time on their hand because they're not training a bunch, and they start getting ideas in their head and they start chasing squirrels. They start trying new things, and usually that is not a very good idea. Novelty during a taper is something you want to avoid for the most part. So if you don't mind taking a second and liking, subscribing, and if you like what you hear, maybe leaving a comment at the end, and that'll help me reach more people. That would be freaking awesome. And you might notice that I'm in a different location today. My podcast / normal video recording studio is right behind the camera. And I am facing not only my whiteboard, but also the door to my attic where we keep a bunch of Christmas stuff. My wife's been in and out of here all day preparing for Christmas. So hopefully she doesn't need to get in here in the next 15, 20 minutes while I go through this video. But also I've got my whiteboard here, and I'm going to impress you guys with some really, really good drawings on what it looks like to taper and what some of the mistakes people make when tapering. So first off, what is a taper? A taper is essentially something you do before an important event where you want to perform as well as you possibly can, where you want to basically display all of the fitness that you've been building leading into that event. So for SFAS, you would taper so that when you go into selection, you're feeling as well rested and not fatigued as humanly possible, but also as fit as humanly possible. The main purpose of a taper, in fact, pretty much the only purpose of a taper, the only goal, I should say, of a taper. A lot of people get this messed up. Really, all you're trying to do is keep your fitness where it's at. You're not trying to build any more fitness. A lot of people think they want to like fine tune and refine last little bits of their fitness. No, you just want to maintain where it's at. And you want to allow fatigue that has been masking your fitness to dissipate as much as possible, so you show up as prepared as possible. I'm going to show you a little graphic here in a second. Well, you can already see it, but I'm going to explain it here in a second. That kind of shows you what I mean by it. Who needs a taper? That's usually the next question. Should I taper? Does this apply to me? And I'm here to tell you this is our really easy answer. Yes, it does apply to you. Regardless of how ready or not ready you are, you should taper regardless, because it takes at least about 10 days to really make any fitness improvements and adaptations. And even if you're doing hard workouts in those last 10 days, guess what's also coming with those workouts? Fatigue. So even if you don't feel like you're ready, which by the way is a normal feeling, most people don't feel like they're ready before they go. That's just how it is, regardless of whether they're objectively ready or not. Even if you don't feel like you are, you still should taper. So you show up as capable as you possibly can, even if you're not quite feeling like super confident. If you are ready to go smash, and you know you are, and all of your numbers are objectively well beyond the standard, then I would argue it's even more important to taper, or do it right and not mess it up, because you could potentially undo or sabotage all of the progress that you've made and show up less prepared than you otherwise could have because your fatigue levels are high. So what does this look like graphically? Here we have my beautiful drawing of an SFAS train up that depicts fatigue here in red and fitness here in blue. Now, this is not to scale, and it's not perfectly linear like this, but it's just a good way to kind of conceptualize it and visualize it. So ideally, this is going to be an example of a 12-week process. That doesn't mean everybody needs to train for 12 weeks. And again, it's not going to be perfect, but just to kind of give you guys an understanding and explain some other things that get guys along the way. So you start your 12. Basically, this vertical axis, I should say, is potential preparedness. If you can get as high as you possibly can in potential preparedness, that's like where your pinnacle is. That's where you want to go. This line is duration. So weeks 12, 10, 8, 6, all the way down to 2. Again, not to scale. As we go through our 12-week selection prep plan, ideally your fitness is going to be on this nice, solid, even trajectory, going higher and higher week by week, workout by workout. If you're planning things right and you are progressing properly and adding in progression to your plan, then that's generally what it's going to look like. It won't be perfect again, but gives you a good understanding. Fatigue is different because depending on what you've been doing for training, how you're recovering, your sleep, your nutrition, how hard your workouts have been, etc. Sometimes fatigue is going to be a little bit low here underneath your fitness. Those are usually days where you have really good workouts. Other days, and this is what gets a lot of people, fatigue is higher than fitness. So it dips above fitness. You ever have randomly a really, really bad workout? There are lots of different reasons for that, potential reasons, but usually it's because your fatigue is higher than your fitness. It is what's called masking your fitness. So even though your fitness levels are here, for example, because your fatigue levels are higher than your fitness levels, that day you're not able to put a really, really solid session in. But, next week, when your fatigue dips back down below your fitness levels, you usually have some really good workouts. So that is probably something you've noticed if you ever train up for something. Some days you feel great, you have awesome training sessions, other days you don't. A lot of people get really discouraged and they think what's happening is their fitness is looking like this red line. Like it's just going up and down and up and down. You get a bad workout, it must have taken a big dip. No, it's just being masked by your fatigue. Of course, if you're doing things right. So throughout your entire process, say you're getting to, for example, 2 weeks out, and you're going to start your taper. You don't have to taper for 2 weeks. I'm going to talk about some durations and considerations here in a bit. But for this example, we're talking 2 weeks. So you have your one last big hard workout. You may notice if you're peaking really well, peaking is essentially training in such a way where your fitness and your fatigue are very, very close. You don't want to get your fatigue way up here in this area because that's when you start running into inability to recover, overtraining, or overreaching too hard. And it takes a little bit more than taking a couple rest days. Like it's more of a serious problem. But if it's a little higher, like it is here, say this is peak week, that is kind of where you want it. And again, it can be discouraging because you may not be hitting your PRs during your peak week. And that's a good thing. You want to hit your PRs at selection a couple of weeks from now. But either way, you're getting to your last really hard week of training and it's about to be taper time. So this is kind of like the pinnacle. If you notice, once you're here, again, we're saying 2 weeks out, you're not getting any more fit. Your fitness levels are evening out right here because you're doing your taper properly. Your fatigue levels take this big dive. It's not going to be this perfect dive like that unless you're just incredibly dialed in. In reality, it's going to be like more of a gradual line, a squiggly line, if you will, if you want to get real scientific with it. But you got to get the picture. What oftentimes happens, and this even happens to high-level athletes as well, because the mental aspect of tapering is very difficult, is something like this. They start their taper, and then they say, oh, wait, I forgot about this one thing. Maybe I can just hit this last one quick workout. And then their fatigue was going down, and then, you see the fitness is still not really changing because it takes a while to actually make those fitness adaptations. But here's a little bit of a bump in fatigue. And they're like, okay, that was a bad idea. 10 days out, let's taper. They go down and they're like 7 days out. And they're like, oh, wait, what if I just do this 3-hour stretching session all day and just create all this inflammation? I'm not used to stretching. I haven't been stretching much at all. That's fine. But now I don't have anything to do. I have all this time on my hands. So today we're just going to stretch for 3 hours. And it kind of levels out. Because stretching is not like super fatiguing, but doing it for 3 hours will absolutely throw a wrench in your homeostasis, your body's homeostasis or balance. So that's 7 days out. And then kind of getting bored, sitting on your thumbs, waiting to go. And then like 4 days out, shit, I feel like I could get one more ruck or one more repeat session in or something along those lines. And then I'll just take a couple days off going in. And so you do that and you get way fatigued. And so instead of your fatigue levels being way down here because you tapered properly, they're like right here, a little bit below your fitness. When you go to selection and your fatigue's right here and your fitness is right here, your fitness is going to continue to grow a little bit, even though you're going to be stressed out, under recovered, et cetera, for the first week or so because you're, doing hard training and doing, your rucks, your runs, et cetera. But fatigue is going to reach that fitness level again a lot quicker from here than it will down here. So before you know it, because selection's super stressful and you're not sleeping well and you're not eating enough, your fatigue's gonna be way higher than your fitness levels. Whereas if it was down here, it would take a really long time for them to meet. So that's essentially what happens when you do the taper run. Now, let's talk about how to taper properly. approximately. I'm not going to go down day by day because everyone's a little different, but I will talk about some general rules of thumb as well as some things to consider as you go. So generally speaking, the longer and higher volume your train up was, the longer you should consider tapering. If you are someone who responds really well to super high volume, particularly ruck and run volume, not so much lifting volume, because that's not going to be quite as fatiguing as a really long progressive train up of running and rucking, but consider rucking and running volume. If you're up in the 50, 60 miles per week of running and rucking volume combined, somewhere around there, or even if you're in the 40, but you're just not used to that. You're not like a long time endurance athlete, but you train for a long time to get up there. Consider a longer taper, like a 3-week taper. If you're where most people are at, nothing crazy high volume, but high volume enough, anywhere from a 10-ish to 14-day taper is pretty solid. Now, keep in mind, if you are not an X-ray and you are going to SFAS, the first few days, I believe it's like 4 days, you're going to take your PT test right when you get there, which you don't necessarily have to be super well, perfectly tapered for. You want to be feeling pretty fresh for it, of course, but you don't have to be as if it was day one. You don't have to be that fresh. But also, you are going to go and do land nav without a rucksack on, but a lot of stepping, a lot of walking, and a little bit of stress because you're out land nabbing day and night. You're going to do that for like 4 straight days before you start gate week. So consider that when calculating your taper, like day one of selection versus when you show up like 5 days prior to do your PT test and all your land nav stuff. For most people, somewhere in the 10 to 14 day range is pretty solid. So say you're doing it for 2 weeks, that would be pretty appropriate for a lot of people. Generally, the way I would do a 2-week taper would be cut your volume down by 50% that first week and another 25% that next week. This is especially running and rucking volume, but also I would cut down lifting volume by at least probably a third to a half. And I would also consider not doing a lot of spinal loading. Definitely work on your calisthenics and things along those lines, but you don't necessarily have to be squatting and deadlifting a week out or even 2 weeks out, and you're going to be totally fine. You'd be better off not doing that. But running and rucking volume, consider dropping, again, 50% that first week, 25% that second week. So you're doing a quarter of the volume that you were doing during your train up in that last week. Intensity, you should absolutely drop the intensity too, but you should keep some intense things in there. When you're doing faster running, especially, I would keep in. When you're doing that, you can either do some strides at the end of an easy run. So for example, like a 30-minute easy run with 8 to 10 100-yard strides afterwards at goal 2-mile pace or goal 5-mile pace or somewhere in between. Or you can do pickups. You can do a 30-minute run with 4 to 5, 30 to 45-second pickups, again, to that about that same pace. Or you can do repeat. You can even do repeats, but again, cutting the volume way down. So if you usually do 12 by 400, maybe the last week you do, second to last week, you do 6 400s. And I would suggest resting longer than you have been. So you get like full recovery. You're able to hit these 400s, but you're doing way fewer of them and you're resting for much longer in between rounds. So say maybe you rest a minute 30 between most of them. This time I would rest 2:30 or 3 minutes in between each one. So you can still get that high quality speed in and stay accustomed to running fast, but you're not fatiguing the hell out of yourself by shortening the rest periods or doing 12 of them. Last week, the very last week, maybe 3, maybe 4. Or like I said, you could just do easy runs with pickups and then maybe practice some push-ups, practice some pull-ups. That's really all you need to do the last couple of weeks. Sometimes I'll have guys just wear their ruck around just so it's not super foreign to them after they finish their last hard ruck. But I'll have guys say like on Monday and Friday this week, wear your ruck around for an hour and a half. Just wear your 55-pound ruck around doing daily tasks. Don't go for a ruck. Don't go for a ruck run. Just wear it around so that you are still used to wearing it. Newsflash, at selection, you're going to be standing around, standing still with a ruck on a hell of a lot. So being familiar with it as you go in is a good idea. If you had a really, really low volume train up, or if you got to your train up really late, say like you made your decision to go to SFAS like 6 weeks out or 8 weeks out and you're generally fit, but you didn't have a crazy elaborate train up, you can get away with a 1-week taper, in which case I would definitely drop volume considerably. Basically, the longer your taper, the less drastic your drop-offs will be. The shorter your taper, the more drastic your drop-offs in volume are going to be. But for most people, I would say 10 days to 14 days would be a really solid spot. So that is about how long, which brings us to what do we do during our taper? All right. So my whole mantra for this, if you want just something super easy to remember, when in doubt, do nothing. And nothing just means sit and read a book or go make a sandwich or take a nap. That would be considered nothing. But if you are looking for things to do, because you're going to have more time on your hands, you're going to have a lot of things going through your head, and you're going to be, kind of stressing about selection. That is totally normal. If you don't feel like that, that probably means you don't really care about it all that much. So I would say that would be more of a bad sign than if you weren't worrying about it. So it's totally normal to worry regardless of how ready or not ready you are. But you're just going to have more time to think, and you're going to have more thoughts creeping into your head, and you're going to have more good idea fairy opportunities to either take the good idea fairy up on or be like, no, good idea fairy, get out of here. And if you can completely avoid all good idea fairy thoughts, then you're going to be good to go. So good idea fairy may show up and be like, hey, should you go get this deep tissue massage on Monday and then again on Friday and then maybe again next week before you go? In most cases, probably not. One deep tissue massage, not a huge deal. If you've been getting deep tissue massages throughout your entire prep and you know what it does to you, that's different. But if you haven't, then don't go and try that, because it's a new thing. It's a new stimulus. Even though you're not actually training, you're still getting someone digging into your musculature and your soft tissue and creating inflammation. Typically, that's a good thing. But if it's novel and you don't know how you're going to react to it, not everyone has great reactions to these types of things. And not every deep tissue massage therapist is the same. So you're much better off not doing that. If you have spent maybe a cumulative 2 hours throughout your entire prep stretching and doing mobility, which is totally fine. If you have solid mobility, I don't think you need to do a shit ton of extra mobility, which is controversial. But so long as you can lift with full range of motion and get yourself into the required positions for SFAS, which is not a lot of very complicated ones, you don't have to be like a gymnast, then it's totally fine. But if all of a sudden you start stretching and doing mobility for 2 hours a day during your taper, that is a bunch of new novel shit. I have had more clients hurt themselves stretching, making up their own stretches, than running, rucking, and lifting or any sort of training combined by a lot, like 5-fold. So not saying stretching is a bad idea, not saying mobility is a bad idea, but it is a bad idea to reinvent the wheel and start doing way, way, way more than you're used to during your taper. Or I talked about some good idea fairies a little bit earlier, where you just decide, oh, you know what? I think if I get this solid interval session in 4 days out, it's just going to really refine my speed and I'm going to be good to go. I'm going to show up and I'll just take a couple days off before I go and I'll be fine. No, that's not a good idea. You're not going to develop any extra fitness from that. You're just going to develop more fatigue from that. So the mindset should be, when in doubt, do nothing, of course, always, but also no new things, no new foods, no new hydration techniques, no new stretching moves or mobility circuits, no new workouts, no different types of runs, different types of rucks, nothing new. The same thing you've been doing the entire time, except way, way, way less of it. The no new foods thing is huge, because most people, they're probably going to be just fine. But if you start introducing all these new foods, especially as you get close and you don't digest them well, or they're messing up your GI system, you're going to show up and you're going to be in sort of an inflamed, stressed out state, and your body's not going to be able to handle the rigors and the stress of the first week. Especially when you switch over to eating just MREs and you're already digesting things poorly. Not a very good recipe for success. Sleep. Sleep is probably the one thing that I would recommend trying to get more of than what you've been getting. If you possibly can, if you have been kind of falling short on sleep, or even if you've been getting good sleep, during a taper is a great time to get extra sleep. Now, one last thing I want to mention, that whole 10-day thing that I talked about earlier, this is where this comes into play as well. Some people, when they start a taper, or maybe you've experienced this before on a deload week or something along those lines, some people feel way worse during a taper or during a deload than they felt even when they were just crushing themselves in training leading into that, when their fatigue levels were super high. Not everybody feels this. Some people feel great and they feel amazing during tapers physically, but other people don't. And generally, if you're on the side that doesn't, not something to freak out about. What you're probably feeling is that really hard week of training that you had last week and the week before and the week before. Your stress hormones are all jacked up. And now all of a sudden you feel like really uneasy and really anxious. That's kind of normal anyway, because you're going to selection, but you just may feel a little bit different. You may feel worse. You may feel a little bit banged up almost, because your body's just kind of catching up to it, because now it can focus on other things because you're reducing your stress, you're reducing your fatigue, and it's now able to kind of go through its systems check almost. Its check engine light has been on, but like you've been ignoring it for a really long time. But now that you have time to kind of not ignore it anymore because you're resting, you're not doing much, you notice the check engine light's on and there's a bunch of shit that you've been ignoring, not necessarily ignoring, but like kind of overriding, or your body's stress hormones have been overriding so that you don't feel them or you don't notice them. But now when it kind of dies down, you do notice them. So expect that as well. Not necessarily everyone, but some people might feel that. And usually if you taper well enough and you stick to it and you don't do anything crazy, and again, invent a bunch of new stretches, that's going to go away before you go, because usually it might last a couple of days and then you're going to start feeling better and well rested and more prepared. So all I can say is during a taper, don't mess it up. There's a million different ways to mess it up. There's only a few different ways to do it right, but it's not very difficult to do right, but it is very important that you do it. And it is very important that you don't do all of the things I just said not to do. That way you show up ready to go crush, and you are showing up with your fitness levels sky high, your fatigue levels very low, and you are mentally and physically ready to go and put your best foot forward. So let me know if you guys have any questions or areas that you want me to clarify on the taper. Let me know if you have any funny taper stories or what you struggle with most when it comes to tapering or deloads. And yeah, let's have a discussion in the comments. So thanks guys. I'll be back soon with another video. Till then, Terminator out.